As we saw last time, the Gothic novels from which modern fantasy developed were set in a sort of pseudo-medieval world of castles, knights, and quests. These themes have lived on in more serious and even darker forms of fantasy from the last 75 years or so, in series like Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast books from the 1950s and George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire from the 1990s and 2000s. While Gormenghast is set in a different reality with its own geography, society, and culture, it obeys the same rules of nature that our own world does. Martin's world, likewise, is full of characters whose lust for power and wealth, fear of destruction, and devious manipulations of one another are familiar to anyone who has watched classical American soap operas or Latino telenovelas. But it's also full of supernatural elements like dragons, White Walkers, and zombies. Another variation on the works of 19th and early 20th century writers like Morris and Lord Dunsany was created by J.R.R. Tolkien, who went straight to the medieval works of the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons to create a modern saga which is about good versus evil and draws on the mystical themes of Tolkien's time. Tolkien's work is also an early example of the kind of elaborate world-building that we now find in the Ice and Fire series and in other books like Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. As in many of the stories created in the Middle Ages, modern fantasy is sometimes set in the past described in our ancient myths, i.e., the Golden Ages before the natural laws, realities, and sorrows of the world we know were created. Movies like Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, and the many sword and sandal epics of the 1950s and 60s draw broadly on a pseudo-classical world of heroes and monsters, and they've been succeeded by TV shows like Hercules and Xena. Sometimes the age of myth is mixed together with elements of the actual ancient world, like classical Greece or the Roman Empire, which was also what happened in the romances of the Middle Ages, where the technology of later eras becomes part of the story. An interesting example of this kind of mixture is the 2016 film Gods of Egypt, whose setting looks like ancient Egypt, but is in fact the world of Egyptian myth, in which gods walk among human beings, and the sun is pulled across the sky by the boat of Ra. Then there's the 2013 film 47 Ronin, which is based on an actual event from the 18th century, when a group of samurai banded together to avenge the forced suicide of their former master, but which incorporates aspects of traditional Japanese legend, like monsters and the kind of fox spirit we saw in our installment on Asian fantasy. On the other hand, there's a movie like Troy, which retells the story of Homer's Iliad. Though it has the tone of an epic, like the huge Hollywood productions of the 1950s and 60s, it actually leaves out all of the fantastic elements of its Greek source, in which the gods of Olympus are characters who have dialogue and participate in the plot. Another recent film set in ancient times, 300, tells the story of an actual historical episode, the Spartan defense of Thermopylae against the Persian army in 480 BCE, though again it has the grand tone of an epic. Nowadays, the myths of the ancient world tend to be imported into a modern setting, as in the Percy Jackson books, where the old gods operate behind the scenes and recruit their human offspring to do their bidding, and the Neil Gaiman novel American Gods, in which the traditional gods of many cultures still exist, but are suffering from a lack of worshippers. An interesting way of bringing back the old gods while making them more realistic and modern was found by the Stargate movie and TV series, where it turns out that the gods have always been aliens who have lived for thousands of years and use their technology to coerce people into worshipping and obeying them. Though the Earth has forgotten them, they still rule over communities of humans on other planets. More or less the same thing is true of Thor and the other Norse gods in the MCU, where Asgard is another dimension, and as Thor tells Jane, "Your ancestors called it magic, but you call it science. I come from a land where they are one and the same." We find more broadly medieval settings in the worlds visited by Jürgen, in Middle-earth, and in Gormenghast, which more closely resemble the stories that were actually created in the Middle Ages: the Knights of the Round Table, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Beowulf, and so on. But like their Gothic predecessors, these modern fantasies are set not in the actual Middle Ages, but in completely self-contained, imagined realms of castles, dragons, feasting halls, and mead. But they can also, like Jürgen, import fantastical elements drawn from all sorts of places and times, especially if they're on the satirical side. This is the approach of Terry Pratchett's Discworld, which is a flat earth of the sort described in the Bible, though it's held up by elephants as an Indian myth. The Discworld contains creatures like fairies, which come from English legend, trolls from Scandinavia, and golems from medieval Jewish folklore. It also, like Neil Gaiman's work, has gods based on classical myth, as well as a personification of death. Then there's the world of The Princess Bride, which is set in the domain of fairy tales. The story itself is being read in our world by a grandfather to his grandson, and though its heroes come from places like Sicily and Spain, it's actually set in Florin and Guilder, which are named after early modern European coins. It also has wizards, magic, and castles. The giant Fezzik is from Greenland, though his name isn't from that part of the world, and he's a boxer, a modern profession. And the hero Wesley masquerades as an English pirate, a profession we associate with the 17th or 18th century. Many other works of fantasy are set in our own world, but they're contained to a secret or hidden corner of it. Willy Wonka's factory is behind locked gates, and the only outsiders who enter it are children who have won a contest. Then there's Hogwarts, which is reached by a special train that leaves from a hidden platform at the real-world King's Cross Station, and the Wizard's Market at Diagon Alley. In the Hellboy comics and movies, otherworldly creatures exist at the fringes of society, hidden in a secret government building in Newark, New Jersey, the least fantastical place in America, or lurking in old New York subway tunnels or under the Brooklyn Bridge. And in Clive Barker's Weave World from 1987, an entire magical race protects itself from a terrible enemy by weaving itself and all its possessions into a single carpet, which is then guarded by an Englishwoman in her house in Liverpool. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which also takes place in a regular town, plays with its relationship with the supernatural. Despite the fact that terrible things are always happening in Sunnydale, and so many of the students don't survive to graduation, people seem to be mostly oblivious of what's going on, though it turns out that there is a secret government organization which does know what is going on. Then there are shows like Supernatural and movies like Constantine, in which the heroes are people whose business is to fight creatures like demons, vampires, and ghosts who are at work in the real world. Though these creatures are found in all sorts of places, and in Supernatural there's a whole infrastructure of good and evil forces which are based on traditional Christian mythology, it's only the protagonists who are aware of this other world and are constantly involved with it. One of the most famous hidden worlds of fantasy is Shangri-La in the movie Lost Horizons, a utopia where people live for hundreds of years. It is high up in the Himalayas, in the region which is actually occupied by Tibet. When the novel was written in the 1930s, this region was famous for its inaccessibility and lent itself to exotic descriptions and scenarios. Shangri-La is an example of what English speakers used to call the East, an exotic place located somewhere in Asia or the Middle East, which was filled with color, spices, and intrigue. This image, which is often described now as Orientalism, is the setting of stories like the Arabian Nights, which was translated into English in the 19th century, and films like Aladdin and The Thief of Baghdad from 1940. Though Baghdad is a real place which was founded in the Middle Ages, the film takes place in a luxurious, colorful city with winged horses, flying carpets, magical jewels, and metallic automatons. A more self-aware take on the East is John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China, which overturns the traditional stereotypes of Chinese Americans by having the supposed hero of the story, who's played by Kurt Russell, turn out to be mostly useless, while his Chinese friend, and an older man who turns out to be a wizard, actually solve most of the movie's problems. Then there are works of fantasy which juxtapose our own world with another dimension in which magic and technology exist side by side. In Stephen King's Dark Tower stories, the world in which the hero Roland lives, the Midworld, is a pre-modern frontier like the Old West, in which magic is partially based on old and now vanished technology. Characters can cross between this world and our own, and the same is true of the world of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, which exists alongside our own, and where magical realities like dust correspond to the phenomena studied by modern physicists. The characters of that world, like its hero, Lyra, also have their own demon, a sentient companion in the form of an animal, which is the counterpart of the psychological or moral aspects of people in the real world. Maybe the most realistic form of fantasy is the stories and movies which critics describe as magical realism, because they take place in our world, but also include elements of magic which are taken for granted as normal rather than miraculous. This is a common theme in modern Latin American literature, in which ghosts and magic are a normal part of a narrative which is entirely set in the real world. For example, the novel 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We see something similar in the novels of Salman Rushdie, such as Midnight's Children, in which the hundreds of children, including the main character, born at the very moment of Indian independence in 1947, turn out to be linked to one another's minds, which brings together people from all across India in its first difficult years as a nation. Then there are films like Cinema Paradiso from 1988 and Chocolat from 2000, in which real phenomena like candy and movie theaters have a sort of magical effect on the people who experience them. And many of the movies of the Coen brothers, like The Hudsucker Proxy from 1994, in which many surreal and improbable things happen to a young mailroom clerk at a large corporation. There's also an oddity called Joe vs. the Volcano from 1990, in which the hero, a poetic soul who works in the worst possible version of a dull office job, winds up sailing to a tropical island to sacrifice himself for a tribe that loves orange soda. And then there's Being John Malkovich from 1999, in which the hero, a poetic soul who works in the worst possible version of a dull office job at a company stuck between two floors of an office building, finds an escape route into Malkovich's head. Sometimes there's a world of mythological creatures and people hidden alongside our own. In the case of Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, it survives among ancient overgrown ruins in the mountains of Spain, where a young girl has gone with her mother during the Spanish Civil War to live with an army officer who's hunting down defeated Republican fighters. Only the girl is able to see these creatures, but she has been lost in the pages of her storybook, and her mother dismisses her stories. In fact, it's never entirely clear if she has created this world herself as a way of escaping the terrible realities of the war. We see a similar setting in the 1988 anime My Neighbor Totoro, in which two young sisters move with their father during the 1950s to a house in the countryside, where they encounter various spirits, kami in Japanese culture, and become friends with them. They're there because their mother is in a nearby hospital recovering from a serious illness. These children, like Ophelia in Pan's Labyrinth, are the only ones to interact with this magical world, and they too know about it from a storybook. The natural association between fantasy and the imaginative world of children, which we've seen as far back as Hans Christian Andersen and Alice in Wonderland, continues to thrive in books written for kids of various ages. These stories, whose heroes are often children themselves, freely combine real life with the fantastic. Max's bedroom in Where the Wild Things Are, and the orderly house invaded by the Cat in the Hat. While the things that happen to these children are generally unthreatening or reversible, There are also authors like Roald Dahl who take seriously the terrors that inhabit the nightmares of children, as in his novel The Witches. On the other hand, the French film The City of Lost Children from 1995 is aimed at adults. It's about a group of children who have been kidnapped by a man named Krank, ill in German, so that he can extract their dreams, which he needs because he is unable to dream himself. Though it takes place in some version of the real world, Krank's lair is on an abandoned oil rig. The film's atmosphere is overwhelmingly surreal. But one of the most surreal films about children, which was also made with them in mind, is The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T from 1953, in which a boy who hates his piano lessons dozes off while practicing and imagines that his teacher, Dr. Terwilliger, is actually a madman who has kidnapped 500 children to play all at once the enormously long keyboard he has built. Though the movie is live action, it was written and designed by Dr. Seuss and is as close as possible to his signature visual style. Of course, many of the fantasy stories created for children revolve around anthropomorphic animals, like the Ugly Duckling in the Hans Christian Andersen story, and the rabbit in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. More recently, we have the many characters of the animated shorts that were run in movie theaters before the main feature, from Mickey to Bugs to Tom and Jerry. Though they often commit or suffer the sort of awful violence that inspired Itchy and Scratchy on The Simpsons, the tone is almost always light. There are occasional exceptions, like Bambi, which could certainly be described as dark, or more serious productions like What's Opera Doc, a Warner Brothers cartoon in which Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd act out scenes from several of Richard Wagner's operas to the accompaniment of his music. Then there is Disney's Fantasia from 1940, in which classical pieces are paired to animated sequences. In more recent decades, Disney movies, like other forms of fantasy, have moved toward more serious and emotionally mature themes, as in Beauty and the Beast and Pocahontas. Then there's Coco, which deals with death and remembering the departed. Nowadays, of course, there are many animated shows aimed at adults, including some, like BoJack Horseman, which are deadly serious, even though they continue to work through anthropomorphic animals. Some classic film fantasies take place not in our own world, or even in other worlds or dimensions, but in the afterlife. While speculations about heaven and hell were once the concern of theologians and philosophers, and were expressed in art like the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch and poems like Dante's Inferno, in the modern age they've become another outlet for the imagination. In the two versions of the movie Heaven Can Wait, from 1941 and 1978, the hero is accidentally taken to heaven before his time, and a new body on earth must be found for him to live out his appointed life. The circumstances are reversed in the 1946 movie A Matter of Life and Death. Here, a World War II pilot is accidentally left alive after what was supposed to have been a fatal crash, and he is given a trial in heaven to decide whether he should be allowed to continue on with his life. In the story of Mankind, a film released in 1957 after the hydrogen bomb had been developed, all of humanity is judged to see if it should be prevented from destroying itself. This story is framed more in rational than strictly religious terms, and the trial is held not in heaven, but in the great court of outer space. Though the prosecuting attorney is clearly the devil, and is even played by Vincent Price, who was famous as an actor in horror films. In What Dreams May Come, which was based on a Richard Matheson novel, a man whose wife had taken her own life arrives in heaven, but refuses to rest until he can bring her out of hell. Several episodes of The Twilight Zone also visit this theme. In one, an old hillbilly who was drowned in an accident is saved from entering hell because the man at the gate won't let in his loyal dog. And in another, a lifelong criminal is surprised to find himself in heaven, where his every wish is granted, only to discover that after all he is in hell and being tormented by his own inability to be happy. In the 2005 film Constantine, the Los Angeles of our world exists alongside an even more hellish LA, which is on fire and filled with terrible creatures and demons, and alongside a heavenly one where everything is bright and shiny. Then there's the afterlife bureaucracy of Beetlejuice, which is neither heaven nor hell, but does require everyone, however good or bad they are, to take a number and wait until they're called. Death itself, again without the theological association with sin and punishment which it had in the medieval imagination, features in a number of modern imaginative works, such as the 1934 movie Death Takes a Holiday and its 1998 remake Meet Joe Black, in which death is an individual who is torn between doing his job and experiencing love the way his mortal victims do. In an episode of The Twilight Zone, Death appears as a young police officer, played no less by Robert Redford, who pretends to be injured so that he can gently persuade an old woman whose time has come but is afraid to go to accompany him to the other side. Death appears again in the second Bill and Ted movie, where he looks like his fearsome incarnation from the Swedish movie The Seventh Seal, but proves to be sympathetic and not entirely good at his job. Then there are fantasies which are set in the world we know, but introduce some miraculous or unexplainable element. In the 1944 movie, It Happened Tomorrow, a man is given a newspaper which contains the next day's news, and tries to use the information to prevent his own death and to help himself in other ways. The same conceit was used in the 1990 series Early Edition, in which the hero tries to use his knowledge of the future to help others. Some of Woody Allen's movies also incorporate fantastic circumstances, even though his characters are, as always, drawn as entirely conventional people. In The Purple Rose of Cairo, a woman in Depression-era New Jersey falls in love with a movie character who steps off the screen, while in Zelig, a man magically blends in with every situation in which he finds himself. And in Midnight in Paris, a modern-day American who is visiting the city is transported every night to the 1920s, where he meets Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Allen also uses these kinds of elements in his written work, such as a story in which a man who is unhappy with his marriage visits a seedy magician with a cheap wooden box, which transports him into the novel of his choice so that he can have an affair behind his wife's back with one of the characters, in this case Emma Bovary. Many of the movies that incorporate miraculous events use them to ask questions about human nature or about the meaning of life. In the Frank Capra movie It's a Wonderful Life, a man discovers that he has a guardian angel who can show him what the world would have been like if he had never been born. Movies like It's a Wonderful Life, The Story of Mankind, and A Matter of Life and Death represent a sort of philosophical fantasy, which raises questions like why we are here and do our lives have a purpose. The most thoughtful of these may be Groundhog Day, in which an unhappy and selfish man is given as much time as he needs to look his life full in the face and decide what's really important to him. There's also The Truman Show, which asks what part we play in creating our own lives, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, about the inherent value of memories, even if they're painful. Another kind of fantasy, which goes as far back as Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, is mixed with elements of adventure. In stories of this sort, a quest or challenge may take place in a world other than our own where different rules apply, as in the Barsoom novels, where John Carter can leap through the air and there are several varieties of intelligent creatures. It can also be set in a different universe or dimension, as in Stephen King's Dark Tower series, or in a galaxy far, far away. Or it can be a place hidden from most people, like the kingdom of Kafaristan in The Man Who Would Be King. And in the Pirates of the Caribbean series, the sea itself, which was once the setting of many unlikely tales up to and including the Bermuda Triangle, becomes a place of curses, magical objects, undead pirates, and mermaids. Elements of fantasy can also be added to what are otherwise real-world adventures, as in the Indiana Jones movies, The Ark, the Shankara stones, the Holy Grail, etc. Adventure fantasies tend to be positive and optimistic. The quest has many light or humorous elements, and the hero ultimately triumphs. But there are exceptions. In The Man Who Would Be King, one of the best adventure films of the 1970s, one of our two heroes comes back to civilization badly injured and disfigured, and carrying in a bag the head of the other one. Both fantasy and adventure have as their protagonists some form of knight. Batman, Obi-Wan, Aragorn, and so on, who helps save others or goes on a quest. The knight may also defeat a monster, as Beowulf defeats Grendel, Hellboy defeats the demon Samael, and Superman defeats Doomsday. And the goal of the hero's quest is, generally speaking, to acquire some fantastic object or perform some fantastic act. Finding the Holy Grail, of course, but also destroying the One Ring and restoring Grogu to his people. But the knight can also falter or even do wrong, like Anakin Skywalker and, on occasion, Han Solo. The high fantasy TV shows of the 1960s, which we looked at last time, gave way in the 70s and 80s to more serious and melodramatic forms of fantasy, like Fantasy Island and Beauty and the Beast. Then, in the 1990s, there were fantasies grounded in the emotional and social realities of the world we know, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which takes place in a typical suburban community among teenagers who deal with the usual problems of home and school, and Angel, which fuses the supernatural with the sinister workings of wealthy corporations. The most recent kinds of TV fantasy tend to be even darker, as the less restrictive atmosphere of cable and streaming services has made room for more violent and erotic series like Game of Thrones and True Blood. And the rise of limited series, which tell a continuous story, especially in the UK, has made it possible to dramatize series of novels like His Dark Materials and Gormenghast. These kinds of dramatizations have the room to engage in elaborate world-building, and shows like The Wheel of Time and Lucifer can develop rules that govern the behavior of the characters, explain the history which drives their motivations, and set out the stakes for which they are playing. While we mostly find world-building of this sort in serious dramas, there are also comedies that do it, like The Good Place, which creates an entire post-mortem bureaucracy which suffers from the same kinds of absurdities, petty squabbling, character assassination, and so on, that pervade workplace comedies like The Office. Next time, we'll look at the last of the three forms of modern imagination, horror, from H.P. Lovecraft to Stephen King. Thanks again, and please remember to like and subscribe.